Hello, room. I want to talk about a problem I found with responsive web design. Over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you how to make responsive websites faster and also how to make the process of developing them faster too, all while staying true to the idealisms of the web. This is a photo of 3 million people on Copacabana Beach in Brazil. 3 million people came together to listen to one man, the Pope, give a speech. And this is the first website I ever made. I know what you're thinking, but it's not true. 3 million people didn't view this website. The reason why I got into web development in the first place was because someone told me that if I made a web page and put it on the web, anyone in the world with an internet connection could see it. Making a web page is the closest I'm ever going to get to standing on the stage in front of this crowd and tell them all about why they should employ me to make their website. The web, it's amazing. To make this website, I had to learn how to write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. These were hard to master, but easy to start using and to publish. What was hard to learn, though, was how to scale my website up from a single user, usually my mum, to a much larger audience. There's a web of best practices that help you to scale up your audience, but learning them is much harder. These best practices are multipliers. If you make your site accessible, it increases the SEO. Make it work without JavaScript, and you'll increase the performance. Make the site more accessible and performant, the usability will increase. As a developer, I often find myself having to defend these best practices. But ultimately, the web isn't about these. They're important, but we don't do accessibility for the sake of accessibility. We don't make sites fast or SEO friendly or work without JavaScript because it's nice. What we're trying to achieve, our actual end goal, is ubiquity. We want as many people as possible to see our site. The more users you have, the more likely your objectives for making the website in the first place will be met. Today, we build websites using the technique responsive web design. Responsive web design will give your website a very high ubiquity. But what do I mean by responsive web design? What is it exactly? Yes, Silvio, it's when the width changes. It's a single web page that can be viewed by any device. People always do this to me when they talk about a website. Oh, is it responsive? Yeah, it's responsive. Yes, Obama, you're right as well. Responsive web design also has to take into consideration building a website for mobiles first. This means making sure the initial state of the page is as optimized as possible. Some users are going to be on big, fat broadband connections, while other people are going to be on really slow, terrible connections. That's exactly right, Al. Not all devices are equal. Some have excellent processors and large amounts of memory, so they can render your site really fast, while others have tiny, pathetic processors and barely any memory, and they render your web pages very slowly. No, Dave. Most people don't own iPhones. That kind of thinking is totally divorced from reality. If you only cater for Apple devices, then you're a dick. Responsive web design is not just about the width. Yeah? This is a nice communication hand signal, but it's not strictly accurate. A more accurate hand gesture to describe web design, responsive web design, would be this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is responsive web design. Thank you. It's a solution to the problem of the massive differences we're now seeing in the client. As developers, the biggest problem we have today is balancing robustness, catering for all these new differences in the client, against agility, getting our websites built on time. I work in the BBC News visual journalism team. We build infographics and data visualizations. Everything my team makes is now responsive and takes about 3 times longer than before to build. The design now takes longer, the development is harder, and there are many more devices and browsers to test than ever before. Over 50% of our audience is now mobile, so we have to tackle this issue. When I first started making websites, I didn't have a clue what I was doing when it came to performance. Maybe it's the same for you. Maybe maybe you're new to the industry and this is the first time you've come to VelocityConf. But I learned about performance as I became better at my craft. Performance is actually pretty easy. There's a lot of edge cases, but implementing the basics will get you a very long way. If you're a developer or a DevOps guy, then these next basic tips that I'm about to show you aren't going to be a surprise. The first one, make the files that are being downloaded as small as possible. Now, you've got to excuse this guy because he's on work placement and he's yet to learn the art of web performance. The next tip, make less HTTP requests in your web page. Now, this little fella is a project manager, so we wouldn't expect him to know this. The next tip, only download what's needed on the page. This dog doesn't have a clue about performance. He's my favorite kind of web professional. He's anyone who likes parallax scrolling. And my final tip, don't break what you've already made. Essentially, this means you should write tests. Everyone has a guy at their work like this kangaroo. Yep, that's right. He's the guy who breaks the build with each commit. While this advice is obvious, implementing them consistently needs changes to your workflow, and doing them with responsive web design is even tougher. I'm going to show you how we did this at BBC News using a tool called Grunt, and a few other tools and techniques that have been built internally at BBC News that will help you to automatically adhere to these 4 obvious rules of web development. Grunt is a command line tool that does lots of stuff for you. It's similar to things like rake or make or ant. It's a node thing, so anything to do with it is written in JavaScript, which is great if you're a front-end specialist like I am. My colleague, Mark McDonald, Integralist on Twitter, wrote an excellent primer on Grunt. Don't read it now. Instead, pay attention to what I'm about to tell you, but do take a look at it afterwards. First up is a phrase called improve time to glass. Now, this doesn't refer to the time it takes for me to get battered while I walk into a pub. 15 years ago, Jacob Nielsen would always say that once a user has clicked on something in your web page, you have 1 second until they notice that they are being delayed, and then 10 seconds until they get bored and start thinking about other tasks. This is still true today. There's been some great presentations recently by Ilya Grigorich of Google, I said his name right, and Patrick Heeman of The Guardian that go into greater detail about this and describes it much better than I ever could. You should watch their presentations. The phrase time to glass is used to describe the challenge of getting something rendered onto the page for the user to interact with. It's 1 second, which is doable if you're on a broadband connection, but impossible to hit consistently with a non-desktop device. The best you can ever do is to try to make the rendering of the page as fast as you possibly can. We do this at BBC News using an implementation we called cutting the mustard. The responsive news site has a very basic core experience that has a very simple layout, is very fast, and is delivered to all browsers. The core experience is good enough to allow anyone to consume the news. We load it instantly, and we give this to the user immediately. On top of this, we built an enhanced experience using JavaScript and modern CSS. It has a complex layout and is very functional. This is only delivered to modern browsers using feature detection. All the browsers that cut the mustard and get the enhanced experience have great JavaScript and CSS support. They have fast rendering engines and are less buggy. This technique is robust because it supports a massive amount of browsers, and it's agile too, as you're building the enhanced experience using modern coding practices. Using a technique like cutting the mustard reduces your time to glass, and will decrease the bounce rate and improve the perceived performance of your site. It also means that you're supporting legacy browsers by default, so you're not doing regression testing with IE7 the day before your release. Now, a lot of sites make users download stuff unnecessarily. This is bad, as it slows down the page rendering time, makes users more frustrated, and makes Steve Sodas mad. You should only make users download what they are actually going to use. Steve Soda's website, http://archive.org, is a great resource for performance stats. Here's one that gets quoted all the time, and did in the previous presentation. 60% of the average web page is made up of images. If we want to decrease the amount of downloads so the user only downloads what they need, then a good way to do this is to give the browser the exact sized image that is to be loaded into the page. We don't want to download a massive image and then scale it down in size. We're not going to correctly choose an image that best fits the required dimensions by checking the device viewport width. Sometimes the image needs to fit in a column that stretches across the whole page, or in a column that is half the width of the page, or sometimes even smaller. We want an automated responsive image solution that this requires two parts. It first needs to create multiple versions of each image. It then needs to decide which version to put into the page. BBC News built a Grunt plugin and small JavaScript library to help you do this. We call it Imager. It's an open source project, so you can use it right now. It was made by myself, Mark McDonald of BBC News, and Adi Osmani of Google. Using Imager is really simple. Inside your project directory, you need a Grunt file. This is where you store instructions for Grunt, and a directory of image assets. In the Grunt config, you set where your original image files are, and how many different versions of each image you want, and finally, where you want them to be outputted to. In your web page, you need to include the Imager script file and instantiate the object by passing in an array of the sizes that you defined in the Grunt file. Then, in the body of your page, where you would normally add an image tag, add this div instead. When Imager runs, it will convert these divs into images and automatically work out the best fitting image to use. Every time you want the images processed, just run the Grunt task and watch as new versions of your images are created at the sizes you specified. This Grunt plugin takes the pain out of managing the responsive images workflow for you, and it helps you to only download assets that will be used in the page. Next up is to look at automating a process to reduce the amount of downloading for your site. Another great Stevie Soda stat is the lack of asset caching that websites use. 56% of files sent via the web have a cache lifetime of 0. Caching your pages is a great way to speed up your site. A good rule to abide by is to add a long caching time to your static assets, JavaScript, CSS, or furniture images. You can do this very quickly with a few lines in an Apache config file. Here's an example from the mobile boilerplate project on GitHub. This means users won't keep downloading assets for a web page every time they view it. But if you then update those assets, you want the browser to download the latest version. You can do this by adding a query string to the reference to the asset, changing it every time you release a new version. It's good practice to use a version number for this. If you have many references to JavaScript and CSS files on a web page, this can quickly become hard to manage. We can use Grunt to automatically take care of this for you. There's a Grunt plugin called Grunt Preprocess, and it's made by a clever guy called Jared Overson. He's the one on the left. In your project directory, next to the Grunt file is a package file. This tells Grunt details about your project. Its name, any dependencies that it has, and also the version that you're currently developing. This is really handy, as you can pass this value into your Grunt file, like this. The Grunt Preprocess plugin is essentially a templater, allowing you to automate the creation of files. Here's the instructions for it. we're telling it to set the variable version using the property version from the package object, and which templates are to be processed into output files. Templates have a simple syntax for passing variables into them. This one will be processed into this output. Now, that's pretty neat, but you could do that with any kind of processor, Jekyll or PHP. And you also still have to remember to increment the number in the package file manually before you release. What would be really cool is if the version number incremented automatically for us. Guess what? There's a Grunt plugin for that. It's called Grunt Version. You get it to watch files in your project, and every time you change a file, it will automatically increment your release version for you. You can set it to increment your you can get it to increment your version number however you want. Now, we wouldn't want a new minor version of our application every time we save a file. So let's change this to add a build number instead. This is sweet, but we still have one problem. Using this technique is not going to work for all users. Squid, the popular proxy server, by default does not cache resources with a query string in the URL. It will use the same date and expires response headers for URLs, so a fresh version of the resource is served with each request. To remedy this, it's best practice to put the version number into the file. So instead of putting it into the query string, you move the version further to the left. Going back to our template, we can easily move the variable. However, this then changes the file name, which would cause us another problem. But we can quickly remedy this with Apache and add a rewrite rule that redirects references, there's lots of R's there, to the versioned asset in the actual file. Future caching your static assets and auto-versioning them in this way speeds up your site, as users will automatically cache and cache break the assets. And it speeds up your development time too, as you no longer have to worry about breaking the cache just before you do a release. The final piece of advice is simple. Don't break stuff. I've got a story to go with this. I have a sister that's 5 years older than me. And when we were little, we shared a bedroom. One Christmas, our parents bought her a really good present. She got Barbie Mansion. She was so proud of Barbie Mansion. Every day she'd organize the furniture, dress all the little Barbies that lived there, and made sure everything was perfect before going to bed. One night, my sister woke up to the sound of me going to the toilet. I must have been quite lazy because instead of going to the toilet in the toilet, I had decided to go toilet in the Barbie Mansion toilet. I had toileted all over the furniture and the Barbies and their clothes. My mum gave me some good advice that night. She said, "Don't do whoopsies on other people's things." Great piece of advice, and highly relevant to our jobs as web professionals. When we commit to code bases of pre-existing work, we shouldn't break the stuff that's already been built. To help us do this, we write tests that we can run with every commit. But when it comes to CSS, you can't really write automated tests to see if things are broken. And even if you do visual regression testing with your code, responsive web design has made this much harder, as there are multiple different whips that you need to do the visual regression testing with. To deal with this problem, the project Rafe was created by the BBC News dev team. My colleagues Dave, John, and Simon were the devs who worked on it. Rafe will take two URLs and visually compare them at as many different viewport whips as you like. The amount of viewport whips is customizable, as is the number of URLs you want to compare with each run. Any differences are highlighted in blue. This doesn't do the job of testing for you, but it does highlight the pages and breakpoints that you should concentrate your testing time on. This massively speeds up what can be a very dull and laborious task. Rafe is an open source project. You can add it into your workflow today. So that's it. Thank you for listening to me, and if the only thing you take away for my talk is the advice, don't do toilets on my sister's Barbie mansion, then you've totally missed the point. We measure success in our industry by the amount of traffic our websites get. Responsive web design is a great technique to help us improve the ubiquity of a site, but it's hard to do right. It's made our jobs more complex, and unfortunately, our job is continuing to increase in complexity. This time next year, the differences between a phone and a tablet and a laptop will be so blurred that trying to make a distinction between them will be a waste of time. There'll be more issues to take into consideration. We'll have to design solutions that are device agnostic and content focused. Slow down now. Learn how tooling works. Get to know Grunt and these new techniques that I've shown you. Your web pages will become faster, and more importantly, so will you. People always ask me, how fast does my website have to be? My answer is always this: be faster than the competition. Thank you.